have stood in battle, where balls like hail were flying all around me. The man standing next to me was shot by my side. His blood spotted upon my clothes, which I wore for weeks. My nearest blood, except that which runs in my vein, was shed for liberty. Liberty is dear to my heart. I cannot endure the thought that my countrymen should be slaves. Revolutionary War veteran Samuel Harris.
Hello, I'm Colin Powell, and I was an American soldier for 35 years. I was a black American soldier, and I followed in a long tradition of black men and women who have served this nation since long before our Revolutionary War. For so many years, they served their nation without their nation ever serving them. They served because they believed in this nation. They believed in the promise of our democracy. They believed in what the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution said. But for so many years, they were denied the rights and the privileges that other Americans enjoyed. Their story isn't well known. Their story was suppressed. Historians did not write about it well enough. But there's a wonderful story. It is the story of a group of Americans who never lost their love of this country, never lost their faith in what the Founding Fathers had promised. And that's why this story is simply called For Love of Liberty.
To the war has gone. In the ranks of death, you find him. His father's soul has girded on, and his wild heart son, he hung him.
The record of this nation's African-American servicemen and women is a heroic story draped in irony. Why, despite enormous injustice, did these determined individuals fight so valiantly for freedoms they themselves did not enjoy? The answer to this question can be found in the letters, diaries, thoughts, and reflections of those who were there. Their words are relevant to every American and speak of courage, honor, duty, and sacrifice for love of liberty. I'm Halle Berry, and this is their story.
When Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death," Negroes accounted for nearly 20% of America's population. Most were slaves.
I was born on the eastern shore of Maryland in the year of our Lord, 1753, in a state of slavery, and belonged to Francis de Shields. He was a colonel in Washington's army. I was with him through the whole course of the Revolutionary War. There, human blood ran down in torrents till the waters of the river were red as crimson. Revolutionary War veteran James Roberts.
In the spring of 1775, England sent a detachment of 700 men to Concord, Massachusetts, to destroy the colony's military supplies. Paul Revere passed the word that British regulars were coming and Minutemen, both black and white, were waiting for them at Lexington. Prince Estabrook was among those patriots who were wounded. He was a slave.
At Lexington they did appear, arrayed in hostile form. And though our friends were peaceful there, yet on them fell the storm. Thrice happy they who thus resign into the peaceful grave. Much better there, in death confined, than a surviving slave. Poet, soldier, preacher, Lemuel Haynes.
Four months later, General Andrew Jackson's army was facing defeat in Louisiana. The British were about to attack New Orleans, and the Americans were ill-prepared to stop them. Desperate times called for desperate measures.
I call on free men of color to rally round the standard of the eagle, to defend all which is dear in existence. As sons of freedom, you are now called upon to defend our most inestimable blessing. General Andrew Jackson.
General Jackson also appealed to plantation owners for help. The wealthy land barons offered their slaves instead of their sons.
If there are not enough blacks in place of my sons, go to the Springfield plantation and get as many more. If the Negro should get killed, they're paid for. But if my children should go and get killed, they cannot be replaced. Plantation owner, Calvin Smith.
Jackson then promised the slaves their freedom.
If you will go, and the battle is fought and the victory gained on Israel's side, you shall be free.
James Roberts, the Revolutionary War veteran who had been sold back into slavery, heard Jackson's speech. Years later, he recalled the events of that day in one of the first slave narratives.
Hardships of whatever kind or however severe vanished into vapor at the sound of freedom. James Roberts.
The slaves joined some 4,000 other American soldiers, including the 1st and 2nd Battalions of free men of color. The men, outnumbered 2 to 1, faced off against 8,000 battle-tested British troops. The fight was brief but deadly.
We felled them like grass before the scythe. Platoon after platoon lay like scattered hail upon the ground. James Roberts.
Six days earlier, rebel forces had also been defeated at Gettysburg, and the high tide of the Confederacy began to recede. In South Carolina, the rebel fortification Battery Wagner was Charleston Harbor's first line of defense. The Union Army considered its capture to be essential, and the all-black Massachusetts 54th led the attack to bring it down.
My dear wife, we are on the march to Fort Wagner to storm it. We have just completed a successful retreat from James Island. We fought a desperate battle there Thursday morning. God has protected me through this, my first fiery, leaded trial, and I do give him the glory. First Sergeant Robert Simmons, Massachusetts 54th.
Fort Wagner was located on a barrier island. The earthen installation was defended by 1,700 Confederate troops. When the attack came, some 600 men of the Massachusetts 54th marched across an open beach. The Union soldiers were cut down by a devastating torrent of gunfire. Sergeant Major Lewis Douglas, son of Frederick Douglass, wrote of the slaughter in a letter to his fiancée.
It was terrible. A shell would explode and clear a space of 20 feet. Our men would close up again, but it was no use. How I got out of that fight alive, I cannot tell. But I am here. Remember, if I die in a good cause. Sergeant Major Lewis Douglas.
272 members of the 54th were either killed or wounded in the attack. The unit's commanding officer, 25-year-old Colonel Robert Shaw, was one of those who lost his life.
We were exposed to a murderous fire from the battery of the fort. Mortal men could not stand such a fire. When the men saw their gallant leader fall, they made a desperate effort to get him out. But they were shot down or reeled in the ditch below. Corporal James Gooding.
When the color bearer was wounded, Private William Carney raced forward to rescue the American flag. As the former slave fought his way back to the Union lines, he was shot in the head, chest, right arm, and both legs. Despite his wounds, the 23-year-old soldier staggered into camp, clutching the bloody flag. His surviving comrades broke into cheers as William Carney proudly exclaimed,
"Boys, I did my duty. The dear old flag never touched the ground." Private William Carney.
For his actions that day, William Carney was awarded the Medal of Honor.
I decided I could best serve my God by serving my country and my oppressed brothers. Private William Carney.
Two years later, the USS Maine blew up in Havana Harbor. 266 sailors and Marines, including 22 Negroes, were killed. Enraged Americans, both black and white, blamed the Spanish and cried out, "Remember the Maine."
There is no people on earth more loyal and devoted to their country than the Negro. I believe in the doctrine of peace taught by the lowly Nazarene, but one must have liberty before abiding peace can come. Force saved the Union, kept the stars in the flag, and made Negroes free. The time for God's force has come to free Cuba and avenge the Maine. Buffalo soldier Horace W. Bivens.
On May 1st, 1898, fighting broke out in the Philippines. Minor skirmishes were fought in Puerto Rico, but the brunt of the war would play itself out in Cuba.
The colored men of America have immense interest at stake. As a citizen and patriot, let him make common cause with the people and again prove himself an element of strength and power in vindicating the honor and claims of his country in the hour of the nation's peril. If die we must, let us die defending a just cause. Cleveland Gazette.
Ultimately, it was Colonel Theodore Roosevelt's Rough Riders that captured the public's imagination. However, much of their glory, as well as their lives, were owed to the Buffalo soldiers of the 9th and 10th Cavalry.
If it had not been for the Negro Cavalry, the Rough Riders would have been exterminated. I am not a Negro lover. My father fought with Mosby's Rangers, and I was born in the South. But the Negroes saved that fight. Washington Post.
The charge up San Juan Ridge made the Buffalo soldiers national heroes.
All honor to the black troopers of the gallant 10th. No more striking example of bravery and coolness has been shown since the destruction of the Maine than by the colored veterans of the 10th Cavalry during the attack upon San Juan. Firing as they marched, their aim was splendid, their coolness was superb, and their courage aroused the admiration of their comrades. Their advance was greeted with wild cheers from the white regiments, and with answering shouts, they pressed onward over the trenches they had taken close in pursuit of the retreating enemy. The war has not shown greater heroism. The men whose own freedom was baptized in blood have proved themselves capable of giving up their lives that others may be free. New York Mail and Express.
On the night of May 14th, 1918, Privates Henry Johnson and Needham Roberts were standing watch when a grenade landed in their trench. Private Needham was badly wounded and Henry Johnson was left to face a German patrol on his own. One of the unit's white officers, Major Arthur Little, would later tell his story.
The little soldier from Albany came down like a wildcat upon the shoulders of the German. As Johnson sprang, he unsheathed his bolo knife, and as his knife landed upon the shoulders of that ill-fated Boche, the blade of the knife was buried to the hilt through the crown of the German's head. Major Arthur Little, 369th Infantry Division.
In fierce hand-to-hand combat, the former Red Cap porter of the New York Central Railroad single-handedly wounded or killed 24 enemy soldiers. Back in America, the story was front-page news. The press called the incident the Battle of Henry Johnson.
Having shot one of his foe down and clubbed another with the butt of his rifle, he sprang to the aid of Roberts with his bolo knife. As the enemy fell into disorderly retreat, Johnson, 3 times wounded, sank to the ground, seized a grenade alongside his prostrate body, and literally blew one of the fleeing Germans to fragments. Martin Green, The New York Evening World.
2 days later, the men were presented with the French Medal of Honor, the Croix de Guerre. They were the first American soldiers, black or white, to be so honored in World War I. When asked about the event, Henry Johnson said,
"There isn't so much to tell. Just fought for my life. A rabbit would have done that." Private Henry Johnson.
In August of 1944, the Buffalo Soldiers arrived in Italy. Ulysses Lee, the official government historian for the employment of Negro troops during World War II, was there.
As the thousands of black fighting men debarked from the crowded troop ships, they presented an impressive and awe-inspiring spectacle. Armed with basic weapons and full-field battle dress, proudly wearing the circular shoulder patch with the black buffalo, they moved smartly and efficiently into their unit formations. As they marched away, every man in step, every weapon in place, chins up and eyes forward, a low rumbling babble of sound came from the troops on the dock, then swelled to a crescendo of thunderous cheering, which continued until the last Buffalo unit had disappeared from sight. Ulysses Lee.
The unit's white commander, General Edward Almond, didn't want them in.
I did not send for you. Your Negro newspapers, Negro politicians, and white friends have insisted on your seeing combat. And I shall see to it that you get combat and your share of casualties. General Edmund Almond.
The 92nd Infantry battled some of Germany's best trained troops as they fought their way through Italy. In letters home, soldiers like 2nd Lieutenant Spencer Moore would write of their combat experiences.
Dear Mom and Pop, we've been on the line for 82 days, and I don't know when we're gonna get relieved. The men are lousy, sick, frostbitten, shell-shocked, and scared. It's no joke to see men you've known, lived with, eaten with, and slept with blown up or shot down before your eyes. Well, Mom, Jerry's being in a shell again, so I'll sign off for now. Your loving son, Spencer.
The day after Christmas, 2 platoons of Buffalo soldiers awoke to the sound of mortar fire. The area was swarming with Nazi troops, and within a few hours, the men were fighting for their lives. Nearby, Lieutenant John Fox was calling in artillery coordinates so that others could escape. As the shells moved closer and closer to his position, the officer in charge, Major Otis Zachary, who was also one of his best friends, refused to fire. The Germans were closing in. Lieutenant Fox radioed back.
Fire it.
No one survived who saw what happened next. But after the battle, a local priest reported seeing the body of John Fox surrounded by more than 100 dead enemy soldiers. Of the 95 American and Italian defenders, 18 made it back alive.
It was rough, but we were dedicated. We were fighting for a greater cause, for our people. We had to defeat them, and we had to prove that blacks would fight. If we failed, the whole black race would fail. We were fighting for the flag and for our rights. Sergeant James Tillman.
It was at the Battle of Chippo-ri that Sergeant Cornelius Charlton became the Korean War's second Black Medal of Honor recipient. Weeks earlier, he had asked to be relieved of his administrative duties so that he could go to the front and fight. He told his commanding officer,
I just don't feel right sitting here while others are doing the fighting up north. Sergeant Cornelius Charlton.
He got his wish on June the 2nd, 1951, when he was ordered to attack a heavily defended hostile fortification. When the unit's platoon leader was badly wounded, Sergeant Charlton took charge, rallied the troops, and initiated 3 separate attacks. After suffering a serious chest wound, he refused medical attention. Holding his injuries with one hand and his rifle in the other, Cornelius Charlton charged into the firefight, bleeding from more than a dozen wounds. Blasting away, he continued his direct frontal assault until an enemy grenade brought him down. He died quietly next to the bunker he had just destroyed. At his funeral in West Virginia, the soldier's father was heard to say,
The death of my boy distinctly makes a liar out of those who have said the Negro will not fight for our country. Those who have felt that the Negro is a second-class citizen must know in their hearts that this isn't so. Mr. Van Charlton.
Medical duty in Vietnam was dangerous work, and in many of the frontline military hospitals, African American nurses ministered to wounded soldiers.
I had to go to Vietnam. I needed to go. Captain Elizabeth Allen.
Captain Allen was assigned to the 71st Evacuation Hospital, which was bombed during the Tet Offensive.
Men's lives were dependent on me, and my being scared was just not useful. You had these guys with massive wounds, not just a leg cut off, but as bad as 2 legs off, 2 arms off, and blind. I had to protect him. I had to make sure if a mortar hit, the shrapnel didn't hit him again. I had to keep them alive to the best of my ability. I sat on a razor's edge. Captain Elizabeth Allen.
Back in the States, African American servicemen and women had begun to receive the kind of press attention that in wars past had been unthinkable. Sergeant Clyde Brown Jr. was even featured on the cover of Time. The magazine heralded his cool professionalism and the actions of others like him.
For the first time in the nation's military history, its Negro fighting men are fully integrated in combat. Their performance in battle proclaims a truth that Americans have not yet learned about themselves. Merit is the only measure of a man. Time Magazine.
Despite countless acts of heroism during World War II, no black servicemen had yet received the Medal of Honor. That terrible injustice was finally rectified when 7 African Americans were recognized for their valor.
These heroes distinguished themselves in another, almost unique way. In the tradition of African Americans who have fought for our nation as far back as Bunker Hill, they were prepared to sacrifice everything for freedom, even though freedom's fullness was denied to them. President Bill Clinton.
The honorees included Private George Watson, who gave his life rescuing soldiers aboard the Dutch steamer Jacob when it was attacked by Japanese bombers. First Lieutenant John Fox was killed the day after Christmas, stopping a Nazi advance in Italy. Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers was recognized for leading the way in France. Major Charles Thomas stormed a village 5 miles from the German border. He later remarked, "I was sent to draw enemy fire, but I didn't mean to draw that much." Staff Sergeant Edward Carter, despite being shot 5 times, managed to kill 6 of his attackers and capture the other 2 before returning to his unit. Private First Class Willie James lost his life trying to save his wounded platoon leader. Second Lieutenant Vernon J. Baker destroyed multiple German positions, then covered the evacuation of his company's wounded by drawing the enemy's bullets. He was the only man who lived long enough to attend the ceremony.
As a black soldier, I fought a war on 2 sides. I was an angry young man, and all my soldiers were angry. But we had a job to do, and we did it. Medal of Honor recipient, Vernon Baker.
God bless America.
American servicemen and women were fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan when back home, the American people elected their 44th president. On a cold winter morning, with 1.8 million people in attendance, Barack Obama placed his hand on Abraham Lincoln's Bible and repeated the oath of office.
So help me God.
With those words, the United States of America had its first black commander-in-chief.
The time has come to reaffirm our enduring spirit, to choose our better history, to carry forward that precious gift, that noble idea passed on from generation to generation, the God-given promise that all are equal, all are free, and all deserve a chance to pursue their full measure of happiness. God bless America, my home, sweet home.
The story of America's black patriots is a paradox. Since 1641, there has never been a time in our history when African Americans were unwilling to serve and bravely sacrifice for their country. Yet, despite this valiant heritage, until recently, no matter the conflict, whenever America was engaged in war, the question, would the Negro fight, was raised in numerous ways, and always with the same racist assumptions. African Americans were inferior. They couldn't be trusted with a gun. They didn't have the intelligence or the courage to fight. They wouldn't follow orders, let alone ever be capable of giving them.
As history has vividly demonstrated, what ultimately needed to be asked wasn't would the Negro fight, but rather why. As African American servicemen and women continue to shed their blood in the defense of the United States, the answer to that question is abundantly clear. Like all Americans in all wars, African Americans fought for love of liberty.